Louis, probably not written by King Louis XIV of France. Hey, this is the age of absolutism with absolute monarchs. Now understand this is not the same as in the modern term totalitarian, where the leader of the country can pry into the life of every little individual. Probably not, but it was more based on a theory. And if we want to talk about the era of absolute monarchy in Europe, King Louis XIV. First of all, notice king for, oh my gosh, 73 years. And actually for the last about 55 of that, he had actual power. He was actually king at the age of 5. France was the dominant force in Europe at this point. Now you might go back and say, well, gee, what about in the 16th century? Well, that's Spain, with all the silver coming in and the wealth coming in from the Americas. Now we move ahead to the 18th, 19th century. Who supplants France? That's England's time in the sun with its empire. But this is really the height of the French Empire. Huge population for its time. 20 million people, that's some cities today, but it was a lot during this period, more than all those other countries combined. Agricultural. One of the reasons that France does not keep up with England, of course, is that France does not industrialize the way that England does. It remains more agricultural, and we'll look at that later on. Louis inherited a system that worked. Remember I've said in the 14th century there was no such thing as France or Germany. Well, when Louis comes to power in the 1660s, there is definitely a France. You don't really need to do too much with this, except know that if a king asks, has God forgotten all I have done for him? Well, he thinks a lot of himself, to be sure. L'État, c'est moi, the third one down there, I am the state, I am France. You don't talk about France without talking about me. Absolutism, it's a term that's used by historians after, although actually toward the end of this period, people start to talk about it. Suggests the divine right of kings. It's not that unusual idea for many parts of the world. The idea that if, I am King Ziegler, well, my power probably came from God. Now, do note, a lot like the Chinese had, remember the heavens sort of provided the mandate, but it was not absolute power. The power in an absolutist system was absolute, but not arbitrary. And that's what the Chinese did as well, right? Because you have the idea that the king has responsibilities. The king does not just do whatever he feels like. He needs to be a good ruler of his people, etc. Again, Louis, l'État, c'est moi. His argument was, and held by the people around him, France is very divided. Different languages, class, regions, religions, especially religions. Look, we need one centralized source to make the country work. And he builds Versailles Palace. Some of you have been to the Palais Versailles, perhaps outside of Paris. It's kind of gross, kind of awful, magnificent at the same time. And I don't know why this does this. It's just one of those weird things many years ago, and I haven't been able to program it out. Yeah, and now it does it again. Okay, great. Come on. There we go. This is the royal home. You know what? Not necessary. I mean, the king could probably live in a 3-bedroom apartment. No, this is outside of Paris. I don't know, it takes an hour to get out there or so, longer than at that point. You just start looking at individual giant rooms. And I mean, this is absolutely massive. And it's meant as a show-off. Look, if you are the Mughal emperor, you are Shah Jahan, you want to talk about the type of power that you have, well, you know what? You really want to show that you can build the Taj Mahal. If you were one of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, look at these pyramids. Well, this is absolutely the idea behind Versailles as well. The Hall of Mirrors serves no purpose except to say, dang, this is impressive. Look at this power. Look at this wealth. Again, the common grounds of it. Oh my goodness, this is massive. I believe this little hand here is where the king himself stayed. But, you don't need all this space for sure. You will notice that the king, Louis, these are not peasants. These are not servant class. These are not the poor. These are the wealthiest and most prestigious people in all of France at the time. And their job, their expectation was to come to Versailles, bow down before Louis. He had nobles that were forced to come every year and spend time at this massive thing, and their job was to serve the king. And I don't just mean bring the tax money. Yeah, you better do that. And I don't just mean treat him with respect. No, I mean serve him in every way possible. Wealthy nobles would argue and fight with each other about who got to fluff the royal hair and who got to bring the royal food, and even change the royal chamber pot. If you don't know what a chamber pot is, I will ask you to look it up and realize that some of the most prestigious, high-powered people in France were begging for the opportunity to change Louis XIV's chamber pot. Why? Because you didn't advance anywhere in France without Louis's blessings. You know, Louis had all this art written. I mean, it's mainly of himself. It had, religious undertones as well, too. But Louis loved paintings of himself. He loved busts of himself, always heroic, always athletic, always powerful, absolutely. Sometimes, by the way, you can get FRQ or DBQ questions that ask about the roles of monumental building or art in sustaining power for a government. Louis XIV might be one of those people that you bring out with those famous, sorry, Seppi's getting excited about something, but I have to shush her so I can get through this. So one of the things that Louis did, and this is awfully smart, because you know that you became a noble if your family was noble. If your father and mother are Lord and Lady Fluffy-Bottom, well, you are a noble. You are noble born. Louis, as you start seeing a more modern world, it's not a capitalist world, but you start seeing bankers and merchants and educated professional class, very often, these are the people that have the money. These are the people, look, a lot of the nobles are tied to their huge estates of land and their bad harvests, and they have the titles, they have the prestige, they don't have the money. The money is increasingly moving to wealthy merchants, professional classes, bankers, etc., but they lack that political prestige. They lack the title of Lord Ziegler. He's just Ziegler, the wealthy banker. Louis hits on this brilliant idea. Sell the titles to the nobles. Raise money by making them spend lots of money to become Lord Franklin, as opposed to just Franklin the merchant. And, by the way, these people that have the money that are increasingly becoming more powerful, can you remind me once again to whom they owe their noble titles? Oh, to the king. Do you think they'll be loyal to the king? Absolutely. Also, quadrupling the size of the military, a standing army. The general idea was, we're at war, better raise an army, get some mercenaries. But that's not what Louis did. He had an army that was around the clock, just simply, it was there. It was always ready. By the way, it was expensive. It was difficult. It was sometimes not ideal, but it was nonetheless made it awfully, awfully powerful. And by the way, if you were a noble considering revolting, you wanted to break away from the king's power, standing army, well-equipped, well-trained. Called, well, we'd say here intendants, but it's intendants, which is how everything is pronounced in French. Local officials, taxpayers, generally not the super wealthy. Bourgeois means middle class, kind of people with some wealth, reasonably wealthy peasants or maybe skilled artisans, or the noble class that wanted to move up and gain Louis's pleasure. Hey, these were the local tax collectors. So Louis did not wait on the nobles who, remember, what is a king? He's the most powerful noble. And many of the noble landowners, well, they would rather keep more of their money and have more power, but, the king has more. Well, if the king is not dependent on these top nobles to bring in the tax money that he needs for his army and his palaces and everything else, well, that's great. You notice what Louis is doing. He's making friends with the middle classes, and that's pretty important. By the way, it has long-term ramifications in French history. And something that we have not touched on before and probably don't need to in this class, although I think it's in some DBQs sometimes, in France went through a whole bunch of Catholic Protestant wars, right? Whole bunch of Catholic Protestant wars. So it was King Henry IV back in the 1590s, Catholic Protestant. You recall on my birthday in 1572, there was a massacre of Protestants, and, it was ongoing. Well, King Henry IV was a Protestant. He was a Huguenot. That's a Calvinist, a French Calvinist. But once a series of other kings or potential kings had died, he was next in line. And he said, well, here's his quote, "Paris is worth a mass." In other words, I'm a Protestant. But if I want to rule over France, where 85% of the people are Catholic, I need to be Catholic. So you know what? If it helps, I'll convert to Catholicism. I'll be a Catholic king for a Catholic company. However, his edict or statement of Nantes, a city in France, warranted that basically if you wanted to be Protestant or Catholic, you were welcome to be so. Well, Louis comes along and 80, 90 years later says, no, l'état c'est moi. I am the king. I am the state. I am Catholic. You know what? We need the unity. And on one hand, it meant there was more money that was collected, that goes to the church, that supports Louis and gives him power. But I'll tell you what, a lot of really well-educated people decide to leave France because of this. They actually often go to the Netherlands next door, which is why a relatively small, very unprotected little state called the Netherlands becomes so powerful. The Netherlands, as a whole, there's a lot of religious discrimination and bigotry. Of course, it's the world. But for the most part, the Netherlands kind of said, you know what? You can kind of believe whatever you want to as long as you contribute to our society. The French economy, and this becomes huge. The nobles, the wealthy people, they didn't have to pay any taxes unless they agreed to. And generally the nobles would agree, well, it's been a bad year, but here's a few francs, etc. So where does the money come from? It comes from the peasants. It comes from the poorest. And this is something that Louis is not able to change. By the way, it creates major problems a century later. Things that he does try to do is to make things more stable. The French do expand into colonies, into Haiti and the Caribbean, into parts of North America. They attempt to move into India as well, and they are there until the 1750s. Mercantilism, remember what that is? There is a limited amount of wealth in the world, and everything that another country has, we don't have. So we will try to avoid importing anything that we have to buy, because then we're sending wealth out, and even exporting things of value. If you were a grain merchant in the south of France and you discovered that you could make 40% more sending your grain to Spain, you can't do that. We need that in this country. So mercantilism is a government run. It's all for the state. And mercantilism, France is the mercantilist country. Easily, by 1700, the wealthiest in Europe, no question about it. Uh-oh, I'm gonna hit you on the head. Remember, BOP, balance of power. Yeah, every country would rather have all of the land they possibly could, but that's not going to happen, of course. What a lot of countries start doing is recognizing some common interest. In other words, if we can't have it all, and with many rising nation states, no country can, tell you what, how? How do we stop the most dominant power? And that's what often happens, is that you will find 4 or 5 countries that more or less get along. They fight over borders. Wait a minute. One country is becoming dominant. The rest of us need to team up. So what you start seeing over the next 3 centuries, and you'll see this leading all the way up to World War I in the 20th century, every couple of decades, sometimes within the same year, countries shift alliance. The idea is if one country becomes too powerful, we simply can't allow that to happen. So this week, the Prussians and the English might be bitter enemies. If they see a common threat from France, the English and the Prussians are now best friends. They're BFFs, right, till the end of time, until Prussia gets a little bit too strong, and now the French and the English team up against the Prussians. You'll see some, not massive. I mean, France was fairly big, but Louis is a period of non-stop warfare, largely successful, and you'll see there's a large area of land that France expands into. My grandmother, by the way, Alsace, Lorraine here, I'll tell you about my grandmother in class sometime, but this is where she was from. Was she French or German? It depends who won the last war. Yeah, again, you're just seeing, you can stop and look at this yourself. You don't need to know it. But the one thing that I think is interesting, and the reason I included this, is notice, by the 18th century, there are wars. There's the 7 Years' War. There are the wars about, Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, etc. Oh, it's a violent period, no question. But it's not about religion anymore. And this is something that separates Europe. And we'll see this as we look through the Enlightenment era coming up soon, why Europe is different in this way. Not terrible. I'm going to very quick on this. You would not need to know the details. But remember that concern about the balance of power. Well, remember that the Habsburg family in central, that's out of modern-day Austria, out of Vienna, had married into the Spanish royal family, going back to Charles I of Spain, Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire. Well, you might remember that this gentleman here, Charles II, I think, he's only the second Charles. Charles is so inbred with princes marrying relatives, where cousins marry cousins. He is absolutely incapable. When he dies in 1700, he was sterile. He left no children behind him. And immediately, what does this mean? Well, some other family has got to take over Spain. Louis XIV is quite clear. My grandson should take over. Now, this is such a threat to the other European countries, because if Louis XIV, already the dominant force in Europe, has his family also controlling the Habsburg domain and all of Spain and the Spanish colonies, that can't happen. The Pyrenees no longer exist. That was said at the time. The Pyrenees are the mountains that go between France and Spain. Well, they exist. They weren't bulldozing them, but this made one big, one huge kingdom that I like to call France, but nobody else called it that. I'm just being funny. What would that do to that balance of power? Well, you'll notice countries that may or may not have been buddies with each other, the Austrian Habsburgs, hey, we got to keep Spain in our family. Well, what about the Dutch? Well, Louis, he could invade us next. How about the English? Uh-oh, wait a minute. Louis is Catholic, and the French are always talking about reasserting Catholicism. We can't see this. So you actually see a 12-year war that goes on as a result of this between countries that don't necessarily care about or for each other, but they were afraid of Louis. I'm about to hit you on the head. I'm about to bop you on the head. Balance of power becomes a foreign policy goal of most European states over the next few hundred years. By the way, that war ends up in sort of a compromise. Louis dies around 715. I don't remember the exact details, but it's more just to illustrate that balance of power. So that's the period like Louis XIV. He's the Sun King. He's the dominant force. You know what? Across the English Channel, the English. Now, England had an identity. By the 11th, 12th, certainly 13th century, England is England. Now, did it include Ireland or Scotland? But it is definitely a nation state that is recognized as that. And a big part of this is the water, that 20 miles of water. You know what? I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember when you're about 63 years old and you're going to see some kind of a news report. We probably won't have television then. We won't even have internet. You're going to have like computer cables beaming through the air into your head where we all share all information at the same time. Something, totally science fiction. I don't even want to know how information will be expressed. But when you become aware in the year 2066, there's going to be some notification, wow, it's 1,000 years since the Battle of Hastings, the last time the British were successfully invaded. And there are going to be two of you. You'll still be friends in the year 2066. And one of you say, hey, you know what? Just learned today is that 1,000-year anniversary of that last invasion of England. Yeah, you know what? I saw that too. Huh. Don't you remember back we had that history teacher? What was his name? Zumbler? I hated that guy. Yeah, man, me too. And I'll tell you, that bald spot on top of his head looked real dumb, didn't it? Yeah, sure did. But tell you what, though, he's right about that. We've watched our lives go by. Man, I can't believe that was almost 50 years ago. But he's right. I do remember him saying that. You know, I got one more question for you. Yeah, what's that? Why are they talking with Texas accents? Oh, well, that is kind of weird. I'll have to mull on that for a bit. Now, there is the beginning of England. 1215, you've heard probably of the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It is the beginnings of limits on king's power. Now, this did not provide rights to all people in England, big and small. Are you kidding me? It's for a handful of nobles. But the king is forced to sign something that at least says, I don't have complete power. I have to consult the nobles. You start seeing a parliament, a congress, a senate. It's only nobles, but it starts meeting regularly. I think 1273 is the first year. And that's different than anywhere else in Europe. Henry VIII, we have covered this separately, but remember when he sets up the Church of England and breaks from the Catholic Church, he doesn't simply declare himself head of the Anglican Church. He asks Parliament, which strengthens and solidifies his power, but the Parliament, the nobles that are in the Parliament, like this too because it sets a precedent. The king doesn't rule without us. Hey, there's a civil war in the 1650s, rips England apart, and you know what? The king is beheaded. People don't behead kings too often. The monarchy comes back, but with less power. And by the 1680s, when the monarchy tries to take power from Parliament, look at what happens. It's called the Glorious Revolution. Basically, and there's more to it than this, but the nobles, the Parliament, the people that, hold the real power say, wait a minute, we don't like this king. King James II? Get out of our country, and King James II leaves. They bring in a couple of monarchs from the Netherlands named William and Mary, William of Orange. You might have heard of the university in Virginia called William and Mary. That's it. And they installed them on the throne. By the way, the new king and queen agree. They signed something called the Bill of Rights that acknowledges Parliament holds the main power, not the monarchy. And that is different than everywhere else in Europe at this time. Then to the east, you've got Russia. Man, Russia's an interesting case. So Russia, first of all, there are certainly Slavic people who speak a language that is called Russian. I mean, they have their little kingdoms and so forth, but it's not until about 1450, 1440, something like that, where the Mongols, who you recall had taken over in the 13th century, they were finally pushed out. And you've got a little kingdom called Muscovy, i.e. Moscow. And that begins to grow and expand in the 14, 15, 1600s. Here's the question about Russia. Is it European? Is it Asian? Well, the old saying is 1 foot in Europe and 1 foot out in Asia. Remember that Asia and Europe as separate entities, man, it's totally arbitrary. There's a mountain range, the Ural Mountains running through kind of Central Europe. You can say it's not really that separate. It's not much of an obstacle. It's cultural. People speak differently. They eat differently. They look more Asiatic in some part. Most of the land in Russia is in Asia, what we call Asia. Most of the population is in Europe. Even so, in a lot of ways, it's more European, but it's different. Also notice that they adopt Eastern Orthodox Christianity, so not the Catholic faith of Western Europe or the new Protestant faiths of the 16th century and beyond. Notice the geography is so far away. I mean, it is a huge move. And one of the things that dictators with armies, from Napoleon to Adolf Hitler, have learned, if you try to invade and take over and conquer Russia, the weather, the distance will probably destroy your army. If anybody here becomes a European monarch during your lifetime and you think, I'm thinking about invading Russia, don't do that. You will get clobbered. There are too many Russians, too much land. The weather is simply too harsh at times. The land itself, it doesn't grow wheat. It simply doesn't. So much of it is cold, and this has been a problem for Russia. They are dependent more on crops called rye, which is, it's nutritious, it's all of that, but it doesn't produce the same way. So Russia's always been more inclined to be food short than you would find in Europe at this time. And relatively few ports. To the north, it's too cold. The ocean is frozen. Part of Russia's attempts to move is toward the Black Sea. They call it the Crimea, which gives them warm water ports where they can start developing a navy and trade. And very important to Russia is serfdom. Now, we've talked very briefly this year about the feudal system, land-owning lords, and the serfs that were kind of tied to the land that could be bought and sold, not that different than slaves. You know what? I'll tell you, in England, that stopped by the 14th century. The bubonic plague largely killed this off in Western Europe. It really did. There was too much mobility. You just didn't see it. I mean, there were French serfs, but not really. In Russia, serfdom continues as a legal entity until 1861, I think it is. And that's a very different system than developed in Again, it's massive. So here we are, Muscovy in the 1416. It's a nice little kingdom, but my, how it spreads. The times of Peter the Great, who we'll talk about very briefly, spreads even further, especially important to the seas, the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, those warm water ports that mean an awful lot, but it is a massive expanse of land. Peter the Great himself, again, the Great means he's remembered, which means he was a warmonger. He wanted to expand, he wanted to be more powerful, and people suffered for this. And I always have some problems sometimes with we only acknowledge the kings who were great conquerors and destroyed people's lives. A genuinely interesting person, though. First of all, he was huge. He was 6'8", and apparently he couldn't stop moving. When he traveled through Western Europe, you would assume that a king would ride in the finest carriages. He did not. He put on workman's clothes and traveled on his own and actually worked building ships and working on the types of technology. He learned what the actual workers, not the wealthy people that commissioned it, but he actually did a lot of this work. And his time in Europe, not being recognized as the great king of Russia, but as some guy, he came back and said, you know what? We're behind. We are 100, 200, 300 years behind Western Europe. We got to do something about that. One, he built St. Petersburg, which, by the way, when the communists take over in the 20th century, it becomes Leningrad. It's back to being St. Petersburg again today. Called it the window on the west. I can't go back to the map without screwing up the recording, but basically this is looking over modern Finland, the Baltic Sea, if you want to go back yourself, and it's as close to the west as possible. And he wants this to be a modern city. He pays dearly to bring in Western experts, scientists and writers and philosophers and architects, make Russia modern. Louis XIV, they're contemporaries. They're alive at the same time. Now, Peter's a little younger, but not much. Hey, Louis, I am the church, I am the state, and therefore we are all Catholic. Great. I'm the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and we are all Eastern Orthodox here. Colbert is the Minister of Finance, but basically attempted to adopt in France and attempts to adopt what Louis XIV was doing. Social reforms. You know what? He said we Russians are crude, old-fashioned people. I want, especially the better people in society, educated, with manners, sitting down at a table, eating with knives and forks. Ban the beards. There actually was forced. Nobles, because this was a traditional sign of Russian respect and brilliance and power, as my great beard matches my great land. Well, he made them shave them off. And generally, could not stand the nobles. He wanted to embarrass and humiliate the nobles. They were the rivals for power. Now, does this mean he supported the poor? No, he expanded serfdom at the same time. But he wanted power in a king's hand, not the traditional Russian nobility. They were called boyars, by the way. There's a different name in every country. But that, yeah, here's another. Carving off the beard of the Russian noble. How humiliating. Well, how could Peter get away with that? Because he could get away with it. He had the power, the wealth, the army. And you see plans to build from nothing, just on the frozen tundra overlooking the Baltic Sea. You see St. Petersburg, his window on the west. Kind of a spin-off. We're going to talk about the Enlightenment later. But what you start seeing in the 18th century are monarchs, and they have a lot of power. They are not Democrats believing let the people vote at all, but they start adopting some of the ideas of the Enlightenment, of rights of individuals. This will make more sense later, but to get an idea that in the 18th century, there is a change a little bit. Oh, the monarch has control, don't get me wrong, but maybe more of a sense of certain rights that people might have. You know, more service to the people, social reform, torture was common, imprisoning people, you slice somebody open, tie their arms and legs to horses and have them run away. That was called being drawn and quartered, and this was a real punishment. Well, they got rid of these things. There was a sense of basic human rights. Whereas Louis XIV and Peter the Great, l'état c'est moi, I am of this religion. You know what? Religious tolerance. You want to be a different religion? Maybe the king is there, the monarch is there, not so much because God put him on the throne, but because he's earned this because he's capable, and that's where his very strong amount of power should be. I think it's worth mentioning, particularly Catherine the Great, a little bit after Peter. Notice this is a woman. It is actually a German woman who marries into the family. Interesting stories about her, many of them, most of them not true. I think one thing we continue to learn is that if you are a woman of great power, you better expect a lot of angry and nasty backlash, and she certainly got it. Yeah, again, educated friend of the great philosophers of France, invited them there. You know what? I'm still in charge, but let me tell you what I'll do. I'll write down the laws. I'll have people written them down so you people know what you can and can't do. You will be punished if you break the laws, probably not in a torturous way, but you'll be punished. But at least it's not, I woke up this morning as the monarch in a bad mood and decided to, just change the law and you violated it. So it can't happen like this. Some religious tolerance. I mean, you couldn't criticize the Russian Orthodox Church, but at least opening up a little bit. And, you'd say, well, yeah, in Europe, there's a lot of religious freedom. There has not been throughout history. Remember, Muslims and Jews were expelled. You had people being massacred by the tens of thousands for being Protestant, for being Catholic. Remember I mentioned very few religious wars starting the 1700s. That's this time period. And, you don't need to know about Pugachev's revolt. This actually came from a European history course. But, again, for all the changes that you're seeing in this period, and you're seeing some genuine changes, they don't really affect people at the bottom. Serfdom continues. Worth knowing about. The Kingdom of Poland was huge, was powerful for many, 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 many centuries. As it became weaker and weaker, it was eventually just divided up and ceased to exist. So you'll see that Poland, which was a pretty major kingdom, is divided up. A partition is a division, and basically the big powers, Russia, Prussia, which becomes Germany, and Austria, the Habsburgs, they agree among themselves to simply divide it up. By 1795, there is no more state of Poland. It exists again after World War II, and then it's invaded by the Germans in 1939 and ceases to exist again. Wait a minute. Why doesn't Catherine simply take over all of Poland for herself? She didn't have the power to do it. Again, watch your heads, that balance of power. Well, we can't have everything, but if we can agree in an orderly way to divide up and share Poland, it works for all of us. And again, you see this massive, I know you've seen this already, but we're looking at it once more. This is Peter the Great's expansion. And then you're seeing further expansion during Catherine the Great here on the left and then further. This is a massive kingdom, by far It's the biggest in the world. Russia today is still the biggest country in the world, even though it doesn't contain a lot of this area here. Here you see where St. Petersburg is. Notice the Baltic Sea, able to get to Europe, trade, cultural exchange, etc. Much different than Moscow, which it's a long trip to Moscow, even in those few warm months. The Habsburgs, the 30 Years' War, will be talking about this year, and if this video gets used another year, we will soon. But yeah, they were the big losers in the 30 Years' War. Sure, the Holy Roman Emperor was still a Habsburg, but had essentially no power. And the Spanish Habsburg, when Charles II dies, it's out of the family. The Habsburg always had a hard time because there are dozens, probably hundreds of nationalities, people that see themselves as separate, all kinds of religious beliefs. And remember, the Ottoman Turks, who hit their height during the late 1600s, they continue to attack, take land, and almost take over Vienna again in 1683. They did that in 1529. They regrouped, and 150 years later, able to do this. Again, this is, and it's a simplified map. You'd say, oh, there's only 8 or 9 ethnic groups. Trust me, there are dozens and dozens and dozens. I don't see the Ruthenians on here. The Ruthenians are a people. I don't see the Transylvanians on here. Yes, they are a people. And also notice, too, that let's say, oh, this is in the central. That's where the Hungarians are. And not really. There are a lot of ethnic Germans there as well. So even within any of these areas, you have major minority populations. And that's tough. Also, by the way, the Austrian Netherlands, what we call today Belgium, that was also under Austrian control, even after they lose control of Spain as well. So this is the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, but it's very ununified, very hard to control. The Chinese, remember, were fairly ethnically homogenous. Yes, there were outside peoples brought in, but people spoke largely the same language and had the same background. Not true in an empire like this. And then Prussia, our very last one for today. Good, I was hoping for 40 minutes. I think I'll do it. You know, there was no such thing as Germany. It didn't exist. There were Germanic people, spoke Germanic languages. They spoke forms of German. The Austrians are Germans. Under the Holy Roman Empire, which again, not holy, wasn't Roman. Rome wasn't even a part of it, and it wasn't an empire. It was often a bunch of city-states and little principalities. Technically, they had to be nice to the emperor when he showed up, but they lived their own lives. So very disunited. During the 30 Years' War, the central part of what we call Germany was just devastated. Out of this comes Brandenburg and Prussia. 30 Years' War, by the way, was the 1618 to 1648. You see this new kingdom of Brandenburg, Prussia. This is northern Germany today. This would include Berlin and so forth. And notice it's, it's sizable, but it's not massive. You start seeing further expansion and unification. Remember the partition of Poland in the 1770s to 1790s? Some of that is German. You see a rising Prussian state. They dropped the Brandenburg. Prussia, not the same as Russia. There's a P there, similar. Unlike the others, whereas Louis XIV has a state and builds a military to support it, it's often said that Prussia started as a military conglomeration and the state was created to support it. The army was the basis of the economy, whereas the nobles in France and in the Austrian Empire, their goal was to sit down and... Sorry, we had a strange noise in the house. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Whereas the French nobles, where, their job was to basically hang out at Versailles and eat faisans under glass and, a military life. Well, maybe you do that as a child. In the Prussian state, the nobles, the Junkers, they're called the Junkers. They're not really the Junkers, but the Junkers. Well, that was the whole idea, is that if you are born to a noble family, you receive military training from the beginning and you will be a colonel or a general. Very different from France. So it is a military-based state from the beginning that takes precedent over the state as opposed to protecting the state. And some argue, I think you can oversimplify, Germany had a very, very violent military history in the 20th century. Some have argued that, it goes back to this. It's part of the German culture. I'm sure you could read historians that would agree and strongly disagree. And again, you look at the size of the population. Now, you can say at one hand, you are noticing that, England has so few soldiers, has this massive population, but you will notice that, and what year is this? This is, I'm not saying, figures the end of the 17th century. You'll notice that the Prussians at this point have only about 30,000 soldiers, but ratio-wise to population matches anywhere in Europe, with the exception of Sweden for reasons I don't know. Notice that in the next 40 years, the Prussian army triples. So for the size of the population, there is a massive, massive army. England, why does England have such a little tiny puny army? Because you can't invade England. And that becomes so important to England in so many ways. That 20 miles of water separating the British Isles from the mainland is hugely important. This might be the last slide. There might be another. I will say goodbye with the likelihood that there's one more. I forget.